Dear ladies and gentlemen, on our conversations with the Eastern Partnership countries, today we will be looking towards Armenia. We welcome Lusine Kharatyan, who is a Yerevan-based cultural anthropologist and fiction writer. Her research and fieldwork have affected her writing quite a lot. She is the author of a collection of short stories, Tee End, Forget Me Not, and the 2017 novel, The Oblique Book. Lusine holds a master's degree in public policy from University of Minnesota, general diploma in demography from Cairo Demographic Center, and a diploma of higher education in history, socio-cultural anthropology from Yerevan State University. Since 2021, she is the president of our Women's Writers Committee. Published with a monetary prize from the first Yerevan Book Fest in 2017, her collections of short stories, Tee End, Forget Me Not, was shortlisted for the European Union Prize for Literature 2021. In 2019, Kharatyan was awarded a grant from the Ministry of Education, Science, Culture and Sport of Armenia for writing her second novel. So welcome, Lusine. Maybe just to remind us about the 90s, then when you look back towards the events in Europe in 1989 to 91, then what's the feeling that you have, or the impression, or the memories?
Actually, it is interesting because when I got this opportunity to speak about that part, that part of time and that period and that area, I was thinking, okay, how was it and how do I see it now? And how do we all look back and try to understand and make sense of what was going on? And actually, it's interesting that it very much depends on where you are located geographically. And that's a very significant element when thinking back of 1989, 1991. And probably here in Armenia, being located here in Armenia during that time and also afterwards, you have a completely different vision because, okay, you know that all these great things are happening, but you are your center of the world. And it's interesting that even such major events like the fall of Berlin Wall and what was preceding it and what had followed it somehow went unnoticed here because we were so much focused on our own problems and issues. As some of you probably know, the Karabakh movement that started exactly the same period in 1988, and then the following years, and then the war that also started in Karabakh and ended like first in 1994 with a ceasefire, but has been since then a problematic issue in our region. So it's interesting that even when I was trying to reflect on what was going on in Europe and how the world is changing, just the fact that you are located in a part of the back then USSR that had its own major changes of historical multitude for this region somehow overshadowed the bigger changes and that happened in Europe. So we were more focused, I would say, on Karabakh issue, on Armenian independence movement, which really coincided with all the other movements that were going on. And of course, well, there were news, what was happening, say, in Prague, and what was happening in Poland, what was happening in Baltic states, that was very much discussed here, but still the focus and major things were around us, like as if the center was here. And it's interesting to see that even though these major things happened in parallel in all these places, because it somehow went really in parallel, we weren't very much aware or didn't really know all the details. We just knew the major things that happened, but we were so much focused and centered on our own issues, on the referendum of independence of Armenia. And it's really interesting, even now to reflect back and see how much we were in line with major developments, because here also there was this movement for independence, there was this movement against communism, against socialist regime, against the USSR, against the Moscow rules, and so on. However, people were not really linking it to the global changes that were happening at the same time.
You actually raise a really good point. During the 90s, we have a lot of similarities in the actions we took, but also differences. So I was listening to one of your interviews about the Armenia-Turkey reconciliation project, and I think you said that not processing the problems in history makes the problems deeper. So looking at that way, then it's how to promote coherency and understanding in Europeans' recent history. How do we get to the point when where we share certain historical events and they are ours, not yours and mine?
That's a very interesting question. Again, reflecting, I think that what created problems for the future to come, and these problems were created by that from the 1990s, from the very beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union and of socialist system in Europe. I would say that, socialist Eastern Europe part of it. So I would say that the thing is that because all countries went into creating their own national states and constructing their national states based on their new constitutions and value systems and so on, they really dealt with the past differently. So we have throughout the region, if you look, there are really different models of how the past was dealt with. Some states went into very deep rejection of communism and socialism, and they basically threw out everything that was related to that system. The others somehow did some, I would say, surface level renovations, but did not really undergo more deeper processes of changing how people think, how people react, and how the systems work. So, and now what we see in this region, it is the result of how that past has been processed in different states. We can look at examples of Belarus and Ukraine and see what is going on there now. We can look at examples of Baltic states and see how it went differently. And of course, we can look in Caucasus and see that, again, there are very different ways of processing that past. In terms of, again, from the perspective of Armenia, I think that in 90s, the new government, the very first things they did, it was a total rejection of everything that came from communism. Like, we were probably among the first states who took out all the monuments to Lenin, Stalin, and so on. We changed entirely the toponymy, like no Lenin avenues or whatever was left in the country. We basically destroyed all collective farms and did land privatization and economy privatization very early on. However, the system, that were things that happened. At the same time, the management system, governance system, and all the chinovniks and nomenclatura were not really dealt with properly. Also, we did not undergo a process of, I would say, a process of lustration, which was the case in some other countries. So we kind of did not go deep into really understanding what was the communism here and what were the bad things about that and what did it damage. We made some changes. We rejected whatever was possible early on. However, later we went so deep into our own internal conflicts and then our own, I think, oligarchs making money and corruption. and all these things that basically the history has not been properly processed. So, and we are facing the consequences of that, not processing the past, not only just in terms of changing whatever was there, but changing, for example, the way the history is taught, the history of that period is taught, changing the public discourse about the past. We did not really have that deep process, which is not the case obviously in Baltic states, which is not the case, for example, in some other Eastern European countries like Poland. They did a process that, well, we can see there are some problems even now, but compared to what happened here, I think you have gone much farther in terms of processing the past. Sometimes I would say it would be very um, I would know how to phrase it. Let me find a proper word for it. I would say sometimes it would be extreme in some cases, because it would not be critical examination of the past and processing, but it would be just a total rejection without really undergoing a process of understanding and then changing it. But some other states where it did even worse, like they did not process it at all. Like if you look at Belarus, what happened there and where they are now. That this is a very important period of time that I would say was not properly processed, and also not only internally in some other places, but also there was not much information sharing and experience sharing between the states that basically were shifting from one system to a different one. So that would be very interesting, because we could have learned so many lessons from each other.
Yeah, that actually brings us to European values and solidarity as a whole. So, for example, the Baltic states pushed for years to get 23rd of August as a Remembrance Day for the victims of totalitarian regimes, right? And now we have achieved it, and it brings the East and West together. And there's also a lot of talk about European values. Mostly they're abstract, but we understand them as something important. So if you take Europe as a whole, the European values and solidarity, then how's the health of those today? Could it be better? Could it be worse?
It obviously could be better, but in terms of values, I think that currently it's a very sad situation for me, because if you look at all major papers, yes, we do share those values. I mean, people who really believe in these values, they basically share those. They share that the right to life, the right to freedom, all the things that are written in major papers of founding papers of European Union, of Council of Europe, and so on. However, in recent years, if you look, there has been so much, I would say, not really, so many examples that not always those values are put in the center, and sometimes state interests and other things become more important than following the values. And this is very dangerous for the population of this region, particularly who has an experience of a different system, because then it gives rise to all these populist movements, all these political populism that are saying, oh, these values, they are just in paper, they do nothing, and so on. So for me, the most important thing now for the European Union and for the countries that really believe in these fundamental values would be to stand for the values every time, and not when it is in line with their state interests and when they see that there would be danger. So that would be, I don't know, that would bring much more solidarity between not only states but also people. Because people look and they think, okay, so what's the difference? We now say that we believe in these values, but in reality, what we see, our leadership behaves differently. in reality, what we see, whoever is stronger, they can do whatever they want, and it's not about values. So it's a very interesting period for Europe and for the world, and I think very many things would depend on what would really happen now. I don't know, maybe this is not answering your question, but as I'm saying, I come from a very different location, maybe, and therefore I am.
No, you actually are, because I was going to ask, do we need a crisis or an opportunity? Because I mean, when we look back, the Baltic states look back at year '89, when millions of people stood in the Baltic Way, or we look the falling of the Berlin Wall, when people tore the wall with their bare hands. So for years the story was that even the old democracies in Europe are looking for a strongman policy because we are too convenient, that people have gotten used to the good life, right? Then we had COVID, and everyone was looking within. But now we have a crisis in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, and suddenly European countries are pushing in one direction. So maybe we need at that moment to find a solution to our common values or solidarity.
Yes, but the danger there is, maybe I'm not, like, the world is always, there are crisis times, and this after the crisis time something is resolved. I don't know in which direction is resolved, but usually this is how history happens. But the danger there is that what, for example, I see now in Europe, it is too much, it's too much, I would say, action without reflecting what these actions would lead to. Let me, maybe it's not clear what I'm trying to say. Of course, obviously, all humanity, I mean, people who really believe in basic human rights and who believe in these values, they are against the war. There is no one who would say that they are not. However, the way Europe acts, for example, against all Russians, whoever they are, studying in Europe and sending them back home to Russia and saying you should fight for your government to get out of Ukraine. I mean, sometimes it's too extreme, because then you create more enemies who would potentially be your supporters. I'm trying to be really, I don't know how clear is what I'm trying to say, because for me this is something I have been also thinking through. And therefore I think there is a need of more reflective thinking of what we are doing on an everyday basis. Because sometimes, for example, people get so angry and emotional about what is happening, and it's totally understandable. It's not that sure, you should be angry and emotional about what is happening in Ukraine now. But sometimes our reactions, even at intellectual level, even at government level, even at state level, would just lead to more violence, probably, and lead to more, I don't know, destruction. I don't know how to...
No, I get what you're saying. Where I was aiming at is that I think the same. We have some common historical similarities. For example, I think in the eastern part of Europe, the message is quite clear that totalitarianism and the crimes of, let's say, communism will not be tolerated, and we will not let those influences back into Europe. I think that's the common ground.
Yeah, that's a point we can agree. I mean, we should agree on, definitely. But what we see a new rise of totalitarianism. That's the scary thing.
So, and what is the solution? One might ask.
I think maybe solution would be more solidarity and more talking to each other and listening to each other, which is currently not happening, unfortunately. I mean, at least from Yerevan, if you look at it, because this is where I look now. I don't feel that, well, there is more or less solidarity between the EU states. There is solidarity, yeah, but basically between, at least in EU, you feel this solidarity. However, I think we need still more dialogue, not only with EU, but probably also with broader Eastern Partnership region. And in this sense, I feel that some parts of it are left out, and they can be easily, because they are left out, they can easily become place where totalitarianism could come again and, yeah, and root. Yeah, that's a very scary thing.
You actually raise an interesting question. Let's say if you yet again talk about Ukraine, then the EU, with small exceptions, has been quite united, for example, with sanctions, and
Yeah.
I must say Europe as a whole. But if we look towards African nations or the Middle East, then they are much more open to, let's say, being flexible and listening to the Kremlin narrative. And China is looking out for itself, for example. So how do we get the European countries implementing, let's say, the soft power or the strong power to get other countries to join in?
The thing is that developments are so fast now. I think EU has missed really, has missed the time when it could have changed the narrative, because narratives are not changed overnight. And with this growing manipulation, which is everywhere, I think it's now very, maybe not very, but it's really late to change major narratives. It could have, it should have been done earlier. However, nobody could predict how fast everything would evolve, I would guess. So maybe really, I don't know, and I'm not sure that you would do that, but maybe speaking more to others. However, again, time is against that, because the other side is not really creating long-term conversation. It's very fast, and it's not a dialogue. It's more order than dialogue. I think that time is gone for really creating new narratives, and maybe only after the crisis something could change, because new narratives would be also born probably not only in the EU, but maybe in some other places. And it's not only about Africa and China. Look at Turkey, which is a NATO member, but still it has quite different position towards the development. So it's a different world we are dealing with.
Okay. But speaking about the discussion, common goals, common direction, then a few years, thanks to COVID, the future of the Eastern Partnership, the discussion was quite silent. But well, in 21, they were finally continued, and let's say we in Estonia have been huge proponents and supporters of the Eastern Partnership program as a whole. So, but and we understand. Let's say, I think we understand what the EU wants to see, but what's the vision from the Armenian perspective? What are the main goals, directions?
Armenia was also very much, at least, not at least, even before that, but after 2018, it was very much, and even before that, I would say. In generally, people are, not only people and the government are very much inclined towards Eastern Partnership and all the programs under it. However, as you know, our own crisis started earlier than Ukraine. It started right during the COVID, in 2020, when the Karabakh war erupted again. So after that crisis, at least officially, Armenia is more silent, I would say, in this direction, because basically it's in a different position now, and it has so many problems, having Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh, having Azerbaijan and Turkey around. So I would say that in terms of civil society, in terms of basically population and government, Armenia is very much inclined to continue the dialogue with Europe and to really follow Eastern Partnership programs and plans. However, we are also very cautiously waiting and observing what is going on, what is developing, because we don't have a luxury. We don't really have that luxury of being more proactive, probably, as some other states can be. But I would say that in terms of values and in terms of democracy, we are in better position now than even before, because basically we had free elections 2 times in a row. And that is a major difference compared to what was before. As to the outcomes of election, that's a different story, how much basically people are satisfied with the outcome and what are the policies that come out after having free elections. That's a completely different story, and how much these policies are in line with with the country's obligations and other things with respect to EU, but also with respect to other partners that we are having. So we are a very complicated place, and we are in a complicated time. But I would say that moods, and at least in terms of civil society, but also in terms of government, Armenia is still looking towards Europe as a partner.
Maybe just to specify, the rule of law, as you mentioned, is let's say an essential condition to, let's say, to join the EU or with the cooperation with the European Union as a whole. So maybe you can just specify about you mentioned the 2 elections, orderly, one would say, and how can EU further help to achieve the goals of rule of law, democracy, and public discussion?
I think education is a major thing that EU can help with, which is, by education I also mean training, study visits, expertise, and helping to build the systems. That's one thing. The other thing is not leaving Armenia alone, which for Armenia is still something which is not clear whether EU leaves Armenia or not. So that to show that it is actively still interested and engaged. Well, major EU programs are still going on. There is nothing different from what was before COVID and what is now in terms of EU engagement in Armenia. But I think it needs to show more active involvement anyway, and not only as an EU, but maybe as individual states also. More dialogue, more people-to-people contact, because that is also something which changes how people perceive EU, how people perceive these values.
So
I am sorry. I think I'm not very. It's like.
No, I get that. It's not a, let's say, a simple solution question, or there's not only one single answer, right? It's complex, and you need to push towards that. But maybe we have been talking about the EU, Armenia as a whole, but looking back to the last 30 years, what about your personal perspective? What have been your greatest achievements, victories, goals in that period? That's an even harder question, isn't it?
It's a very hard question because, well, I say it is hard because now we start to, I mean, everybody in Armenia, most people in Armenia are in a mood that we start all over again. So therefore, it's a hard time for me to answer that question, probably, because I have been really engaged in civil society very much. I have been engaged in education programs. I have been engaged in culture. And I have been very much pro-European values and having whatever, I mean, through trainings, through education programs, through writing, through many different means. I have been very much promoting and standing for those things. However, we are now in a new stage where it's not like we don't believe in that anymore. No, we believe, I would say I personally do believe in these values, and that are the values that I share personally. However, I have to think how it could be really worked out in our situation. That's one thing. And me personally, what could I do as a person? How could I help with people to not be so disappointed that they would lean towards totalitarianism again? And these moods are there. It's not that they are not. Personally, for example, I have been really engaged in projects that were about processing the past in Armenia and also totalitarian past in Armenia. And I now think that we started too late, probably. We started this project in 1912, 1913, which is to me too late. We could have done it earlier. When I'm now trying to understand what went wrong. I also think that we could have been, no, it's not only about this project, but for example, corruption, maybe we could have fought better and earlier. And then changes could have happened earlier that would then take the country into a different direction. This is a very personal reflection for me because I think that many things were late, maybe, but it's also because it takes time until you accumulate certain knowledge and you feel that you could do something. So it is always time consuming, particularly when you work with values. It's the most time consuming thing. Because changing values and changing culture is not done overnight, while the destruction is something that is easier and it just destroys whatever has been created before. So for me, we are now in a situation where it takes much more effort to understand, well, okay, I believe in those values. What could I do that we as a society do not give up? What could I do that we as a society also feel that there is solidarity with us outside our borders, which we usually don't feel. For example, during the Karabakh war, there was this lack of solidarity outside Armenian borders because the narratives about the conflict were again manipulated, and we did not succeed to create a narrative that would be about people and people's lives and not about land or whatever interests. So it is always time consuming to create narratives you believe in, but it is even more time consuming to really create these I would say chains of people who think similarly and who really work together towards whatever values they believe in. And for me, that solidarity is not there, obviously, and because the solidarity, at least from this perspective, I believe that there is still some solidarity within European space and within EU, and but it's not here, so it's harder for us now to build these bridges and to really continue working on whatever we believe in. That's the thing. I would say just not being left alone would be enough, and that is not what we are now feeling.
Thank you, Lusine.
It was too...
No, it was actually wonderful. Thank you for...
Unstructured.
Thank you for the time, and I'm sure that we will hear from you again.
Thank you.
So this was Lusine Kharatyan, and I think she put it nicely that working towards the future is never easy, that you have to look within and the long-term goals of European solidarity and cooperation will be achieved. Thank you.